Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Leek.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody.
We're so glad that you joined us. I'm Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika Leek. And this is our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. And those of you who have joined us before know that we really try to talk about those things that prevent us from being the society that we want, which is socially just and free.
Yes.
And we really seek to make sure that we have conversations that challenge us all to be the change that we want to see.
Yeah. So today our topic is another heavy one. You know, I'll tell you, our last podcast was
Pretty
really
heavy.
kind of heavy.
Yeah.
But you know, when we're talking about, equity or racial equity, it is heavy. You know, it's really difficult to not be, we can't joke about these things because it's not a funny matter.
Well, and I think it's literally an answer to the question of the title of our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? You know, it's hard because these topics are really heavy and it exhausts people, not only to undergo it and to endure some of the challenges that come along with some of the concepts and systems that we talk about, but also to even talk about it. Sometimes to talk about it, it gets so complex and so heavy and so triggering that people intentionally stay away from it. But what we're saying is, let's not avoid it anymore.
Right. Let's lean into these conversations.
Yeah.
I feel like the more we can talk about the difficult topics, it's kind of like in our marital relationships. So once we can have that really intimate conversation about something that's really challenging, we can now move forward.
Yes.
You know, and so
and we're better for it.
we are.
We're better for it. After
We're
those
stronger
really
communicators.
That's right.
We have a closer relationship with one another.
Yes.
And isn't this all about relationships?
It absolutely is.
You know, when we have these conversations, we really are having them kind of as a model for you to encourage you to have the conversations. And we know when it comes to the topic of race, that is one of the most uncomfortable conversations that people can have and avoid. And society, quite honestly, has not given people permission to have these conversations.
That's right.
Because if you're uncomfortable, we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah, we'll stay away from it.
Right.
We'll stay away from it.
You know, that's the whole reason why talk therapy is so important, because when we talk about it, we feel better.
That's right.
So
absolutely.
And, psychology is one of my degrees, and so it's like I know that it's really important for us to not hold on to, topics and issues and concerns, and not have opportunities to really express ourselves. So this is what we're doing. We're trying to express ourselves. We're trying to have open dialogue about uncomfortable topics.
Yes.
We want to encourage you to not be afraid to venture into the uncomfortable space, because that's where our growth is.
That's right.
That's where we have an opportunity to learn. And so today we're going to talk about, how did we get there?
So how did we get in a space?
Or how did we get here?
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 Yeah.
How did we get into a space where, racial inequities are, just sort of the rule of the day?
Yeah.
How did we get to a space where, there are, kids in certain school districts, it's just, sort of taken for granted, or we know that they're not getting the high quality educational experience as other kids in other districts. How did we get to a place where we know, from outcomes that we talked in an earlier podcast about sort of the lack of teachers of color, and we just take it as a, as a not a rule of thumb, but it's just a part of sort of the society that we live in. You know, over incarceration rates of Black men, like all of those, you know, underemployment of Black men and women. So how do we get here? How do we get into this space, particularly in the education space, where racial inequities are, you know, just a given? Yeah, where did that come from?
It was not by accident. It was not. It's not by happenstance. Unfortunately, it was by design. And there's a lot of research out there to support what we're going to talk about today, to help you understand some of the history behind the inequities that exist, in particular in our school system, and why we see such great disparities among children of color, in particular Black and brown children, as compared to their white and their Asian peers. You see outcomes that are vastly different. And it's easy to say, well, these kids aren't motivated, or these kids aren't, you know, they're not coming with the same level of language, or these kids aren't, their parents don't have education, and they don't value education. All of that is a deficit mindset and a deficit view of students. And it's very narrowed because you obviously don't understand the root causes or the history behind, you know, why some Black and brown students struggle, and what's behind all of that. And so I think, you know, this topic today, like, you know, some of our other topics, is a heavy one. And understanding it is really heavy. You know, we can look at a lot of data around our students of color, Black and brown students in particular, and we can see that their academic outcomes are not where their white and their Asian counterparts are. We can also see where they have not had the opportunities and access to AP honors and gifted and talented courses. We've talked about that in an earlier podcast. We can see where they are disciplined at higher rates than their peers, where they are identified as special education students at higher rates than their peers. And all of that is not by accident.
Very true. So then let's talk about the origins of, let's just talk about the beginnings of the public school system. So if you're an educator joining in, you probably know that, you know, the mass school system or the public school system really kind of started around the time that in the 1800s, right? So before then, there really was no system, particularly for poor white students. Like for those that were upper middle class and wealthy, there were private tutors. And that was a big business, or private boarding schools. And so there was really sort of this private system. But around the 1800s, some of you may have heard of Horace Mann. There were these kind of these common schools that started to pop up. So we have this one system on the one hand that was designed for poor white students, right? Because at that time, a wealthy family would never send their child, and we still have that sometimes, right? We still have that in some cases. They would never send their child to this common school system. But at the same time, at the 1800s, there are a group, an entire population that is enslaved in the South. And not only are there no schools for them, but it is against the law at this time to teach any African American, any enslaved person to read or to write.
That's correct.
I mean, and, you know, at that time, those who, you know, the people who owned those forced labor camps, those plantations, they actually could have been fined, or it was against the law. So you could not teach your anybody who was enslaved to read or write. So it starts
let's
there.
Stop there just for a moment.
Yeah.
So what is it that you think that they were trying to stop from happening?
Enlightenment, empowerment.
Right. Because when, if they're enslaved people were readers and writers, what could they have done? And some became readers and writers.
They sure did.
It was against the law.
Sure
some did. And we also see, former enslaved people having written texts that we have access to today.
Frederick Douglass is a perfect example.
Sojourner Truth. And, so we can see the power behind them being able to read and write.
Right.
Because now they can advocate for themselves.
That's right.
They can speak up. They can share a perspective. So all of that was illegal.
And what's interesting, just in terms of when you look at, the United States did not invent slavery, obviously, right? And so when you look at other slave-owning systems and societies, they did not necessarily prevent, their enslaved people. It's so interesting the way that sort of slavery kind of develops in this society. We know that in, let's say, like even in ancient Greece, that it was actually enslaved people who did a lot of the reading and writing. I mean, that was their job, right? But here, there was this system that said, we know the power that comes with the written word. We know the power that comes with literacy.
And we don't want you to have that power.
And we don't want you to have that power. So there's this really very deliberate system that is part of the marginalization and is part of the oppression to keep this skill, this learning away from this population. At the same time, this system of schooling is birthed and being developed.
Right.
And so at the start of, the sort of, at the time it's called like common schools, but at the start of the public school system in the United States, we do have this sort of bifurcated or this really dual system. And by the way, that common school was only for poor whites. So we see this starting. So there is a socioeconomic sort of element to it as well. And we see how school is used in different spaces. So for instance, in the indigenous population with the Native Americans, school is used really to educate the culture out of them. Right.
To erase their native culture.
That's right. So school is used as erasure. And it is the same for Mexican
and violence.
And violence.
Right.
That's right. And the same is used for Mexican children as well. And so we see these really sort of calculated approaches, how school and education is used to marginalize and oppress these different populations. But for African Americans, it is withheld en masse, completely.
Right.
And it is illegal to even think about it, right? So then after, emancipation, after the Civil War, we have this free group now, right? They are no longer enslaved. And so then we have in the school system, we actually have communities that say, communities of Black people who are freely, newly freed, and they say, like, we want to learn because we know that that's been withheld. So they say, we want to learn.
And they form their own schools.
That's right.
And, as early as the early 1900s, while some schools, the white schools were getting funding from the government, many of those Black schools were not getting the funding. Or later on, if they got any funding, it was significantly less. If they got, if the white community was given, 10 school buses, that Black community might be given one school bus.
Or none.
And there were major disparities in how funding, the allocation of funds to took place.
Yes.
We even see, I was at, last year I visited the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, and I pulled this up on my phone because I took a picture of and it says, you do the math. You know, black schools are not equal to white schools. And it talks about the difference in teacher salaries. And this was around 1916, where in Georgia, teachers, white teachers earned $200 more than black teachers. And at that time, they were earning like $319 in salary versus $119. So that's a $200 difference. In South Carolina, there was another $200+ difference. In Louisiana, there was a almost $400 difference, where white teachers earned $529, black teachers earned $160. School funding was very different. When they looked at public funding for the construction of colleges, the fund and public funding means that's the funding that came from the government. So 92.24%, 94, so let me do it again, 92.24% was allocated for the white schools to be constructed, and 7.76% was allocated for the black schools. When it came to expenditure on instruction per pupil, and this is in 1935, $71.13 was allocated for white students, while $37.57 was allocated for black students. And so we see major discrepancies early in our history where the funding wasn't even there. We're not even going to give you the funding to create spaces that are equal to or even better than, God forbid, that wasn't going to happen, you know, than the white students in the country. And so so we see this huge discrepancy. And mind you, the vast majority of you know, enslaved people, black people, lived in the South. You know, until we have the Great Migration, which took place over a number of years, where we saw blacks leaving the South, sometimes not even easily able to leave the South, to migrate to the North, where they believed there were opportunities, still encountering, you know, sections of society that were discriminatory. And so, you know, even when I talk to like my father and his peers in, you know, and they're in their 70s currently, and they were in the Chicago public school system in the 60s. In the 60s, they were protesting because they didn't see representation of black teachers or administrators. They were protesting because they didn't have equal and fair treatment in their schools. And of course, this was a time where protesting was, you know, probably more, you know, readily not accessible, that's not the right word, but was happening more. And this was a time that it was acceptable, if you will. But pre-Brown v. Board, which was 1954, pre-Brown v. Board, you know, the segregation that took place in schools also was a segregation monetarily, you know, in terms of allocation of resources. And that was by design.
Yes, it was. And that's even in the communities where there were schools, it wasn't a guarantee that kids would actually be allowed to go.
Right.
I was reading the biography of Fannie Lou Hamer. Grew up in, you know, she was born and raised in Mississippi. She was born, I think, in the 1920s. And one of the things that she said was, you know, they were a sharecropping family. And so that meant that the owner of the land really got to determine, you know, who went to school. And so when she was in 6th grade, she was forced to stop because the owner of the land said, we need more people working here. She can no longer go to school. So even in like the economic system, you know, even if there were, you know, even when there were, you know, these substandard schools, you know, it didn't always mean that kids were allowed to go very often. They were, and you know, so
I wouldn't so much say substandard as I would say under-resourced.
Under-resourced,
you know, because, you know, they worked with what they had.
Yes.
You know, and while, you know, what they had wasn't what their counterparts had, And I guess, by default, I guess that is substandard. But really, it's because it's under-resourced. So now we're talking about generations.
Yeah, that was going to be my next point.
There you go. Go ahead.
Year after year, right? So we're talking, so Reconstruction starts maybe 1870s or so.
After the Civil War.
Right? So we have Reconstruction. So year after year. So Reconstruction is like sort of a bright spot that kind of went,
a little
came
renaissance.
And went. Yes,
right. But it was quickly shut down.
Yes, right.
So where, Blacks were rising in politics, in government, in various aspects of society.
Yes.
It quickly shifted gears with, the next president
Rise
that
of the
came.
Jim Crow South and so
there were the black laws.
Yep.
Which also limited. So sometimes when Black families wanted to move north, they were stopped.
That's right.
And it was against the law for them to leave and travel outside of the state.
Lots of accounts of Black people leaving the South in the middle of the night. Right? Lots of escaping.
Freed Black people.
Black. That's right. Escaping. And so when we think about the schools, when we think about these under-resourced schools, there's generation after generation after generation. My own grandmother went to the 6th grade, and she just could not continue in school anymore. She herself lived on in a sharecropping family, and she went to work as a domestic. And
my grandfather went to 10th grade. He received his GED as a senior citizen.
Yeah, my grandfather didn't go to school at all, and so generation after generation after generation. Now, think about the white families, who back in the 1800s were able to send, the poor white families were able to send their kids to school, right? And so they gain skills and they gain literacy, and year after year and generation after generation, we do a little bit better, and we do a little bit better economically, and we're able to send our kids to better schools, and we're able to do that.
Let's talk about the GI Bill that comes along, again, pre Brown v. Board, and the GI Bill gave, soldiers, veterans, access to resources to be able to buy homes, buy property, thus creating the middle class, go to college. And while it should have been extended to all of the Black soldiers, they did not all receive the GI Bill. They were not all able to take advantage of that because of the way the system was set up.
That's right.
And then we look at housing in this country. There was redlining, which was a way, like this was legislation that allowed communities to be divided based upon color, and that loans weren't given to people who lived in certain areas, typically Black people. And that redlining also meant that, the property values were going to be extremely low, which wipes out the opportunity for economic wealth. There's a huge economic gap. That gap still exists, by the way, today.
Yes.
So, we have not even corrected what was intentional.
Right.
It hasn't even been corrected. There's a huge wealth gap between white families and Black families and Latino families in our country. Yeah. It still exists today.
It's still, the original question was, how do we get here?
How do we get here?
And so these systems, these systems that we're, describing and talking about, the way that they started really sort of translates into, it answers the question, how did we get here? We are still dealing with redlining.
Yep.
When we look at, the ghettos in the, in these under-resourced areas, and everybody says, well, they have resources now, but the truth is, they don't. And they were created to not have resources.
Right. And a lot of urban areas experience white flight.
Yeah.
So what that meant was that the, white families and businesses left, leaving marginalized groups of people, groups of people who have been marginalized, in communities that don't have resources, because our school system is based on the taxes of that community.
That's right.
And so if you've got people who are living in the area who are not homeowners or who don't own businesses and the businesses aren't paying taxes to help support the school system, we still today have under-resourced schools all across this country filled with a majority minority. I don't like the word minority, but a majority students of color. And so if they're under-resourced, that means that these children are not getting access to what their counterparts are getting in wealthier areas.
Yes. And, the part of the challenge is, when we find a school that's in a community that is under-resourced, and let's say, I know like years ago, in New Jersey with the Abbott ruling, and they got all this money, and they're still, but it's like, this is generational. So after 2 or 3 years or 5 years or even 10 years of more money in a school district, it doesn't erase, the harm from redlining. Redlining also said that, you can't get a mortgage in that community. And if you do get a mortgage, it can't be insured. And you know what the standard for redlining was? 10. So I think it was something like 10%. If 10% of African Americans lived in a community, that community was redlined. Think about that. And that was federal legislation. It was federal policy. It was the American government. And so when we think about these communities that are under-resourced,
we still see today. We still see today where Black families have to take pictures off their walls when they look to sell their homes to get the higher values. Today we still see that. And so you want to know why it is that there are these major gaps in wealth, and gaps in income, and gaps in in terms of the access students have to high quality schooling and instruction. This was all made. This was all designed.
It was all designed because even when we were talking about
and systems, well documented, by the way.
Yes. So we talked in an earlier podcast about the lack of access that Black and Hispanic students have to AP and honors, even if they're in an integrated school district. And that was really a part of the way to appease white parents who said, okay, if we have to deal with integration, we will, but we want our kids to be separate. And so they devised the way that they did that was, okay, so maybe they can come in the same school district, but then, we'll have these really different systems. And
tracking.
The tracking system.
We will track students.
Yes. Again, like you said, well documented. So when we think about how we got here, how do we get to this place where we are still struggling? We talked in an earlier podcast about the fact that we still struggle with, having, representation of African American teachers and Latino teachers. And, it was by design.
Yes.
It was by design. And, as long as it took for us to kind of get to this place and have these really disparate outcomes, it's going to take the intention, because those were intentional systems. But it will take equally intentional people like you and me, and like you listening, to say, we're going to dismantle this system. We're going to dismantle this system.
I really thought when the pandemic hit that we had an opportunity to rethink schooling. And sadly, in our state, we didn't change anything. Nothing really changed.
Anything. We did more, because we did more testing, and we did, you know what I mean? We did more of those practices that separate kids.
Right. And we didn't rethink how schooling could happen so that no child feels marginalized, or we don't have, large groups of students of color in the most under-resourced schools in our state.
That's right.
And New Jersey, by the way, this is our state, and you may be watching from somewhere else, but New Jersey is the 6th most segregated state in the country.
That's right.
Currently.
6.
Yes. Right. We're not the South. We're not the South.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And which is interesting because New Jersey also has really high numbers of diversity, right?
Right.
So, the fact that, segregation is alive and well, that is the result of another system. But we will have to
revisit that. We will have to revisit that.
But as you can tell, we are pretty, we've studied this a lot. We've read a lot about this. We've studied this. And to a large extent, we've lived quite a bit of it.
Yeah. And so we really want to know what you think about this topic because, this is a topic that there's a lot that you can read about this. There's a lot to understand. And we're still learning. There's still things that we're learning too on a regular basis. But, we encourage you to share your feedback with us and to share this podcast and even have some open dialogue with your colleagues about this topic or your friends about this topic. But then the other question is, what are you going to do about it?
That's right.
What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, what are going to be your intentional moves to dismantle this system that has marginalized
groups of students,
many of which or some of which you may work with?
Yeah, for far too long.
Yeah.
So we thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Tonya.
And I'm Erika. And we look forward to seeing you in the next podcast. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.